right, Mr. Nick Salazar, we want to interview you because we know you remember a lot of things about Los Alamos. Can you first tell us the first time you went to Los Alamos?
As an employee?
Or whichever way. The first time you passed through Los Alamos or went to Los Alamos, and what were the circumstances?
Oh, this was the early 40s. My parents had some sheep up at Valle Grande. Mm-hmm. And as a consequence, every summer as a student after school, I used to go help my parents, mm-hmm. and the family to in the woolling season. And so it was kind of interesting. We used to go through where the Fuel Lodge is now located in the Boys Ranch or whatever. But more than that, I remember bringing the wool down in the wagons, that there was a big load of big gunny sacks full of wool that it was so heavy and that the road was no good. We were very poor that we had to tie a tree behind the wagon in order to be able to get it down to the canyon. Mm-hmm. And then, from there, we used to bring it down to a railroad train. We used to have a train there by Santa Clara. And we did the same thing with the lambs, and we used to bring them there, and they'd load them in the train for market. But those were my first encounters. I remember seeing Los Alamos at the time, real beautiful Boys Ranch. But more to the point of the interview, I guess, is back in 1945, as a high school student, in the summers, was able to get a job at the Manhattan Project at the time. And my first job was the mess attendant. I used to work in the mess hall there where all the soldiers and a lot of the scientists themselves came to eat. And so I worked there in summers, and then I came back to school. Mm-hmm. And so, but I remember taking the trips up to Los Alamos at the time, riding the buses, riding the trucks in the back of the pickup, with a cover over it. And one of the things that, I've always been kind of afraid of when it comes to the elements, and I guess the fumes from the truck, the vehicles. And by the time I got there, I was kind of sick. But so I decided that we were going to stay up at the laboratory. And they had some so-called Quonset huts, I think they called them at the time. It was a 5-room little hut that housed most of us. And so we stayed there, and we used to, go up in the morning, get up early in the morning. I think 5 o'clock in the morning, we had to be there at the mess hall to get breakfast and all that ready for the soldiers that were there at the time. So that was part of my job. Was back in 1945. I still have the documents, where I finally left back to school. But one of the interesting things about the laboratory at the time was the kind of the interaction that we had with people who lived at Los Alamos, primarily the soldiers, that used to have dances in the courts, we all used to attend dances there. And at times we get in a little hassle with the soldiers, as the dance went on, and most of the girls that were up there were girls from the valley. And we knew them, and we sometimes got a little hassle because we wanted to dance too, and the soldiers were too many that sometimes there wasn't enough women around to dance. But those were the early years. I do remember a lot of the people who were there, Oppenheimer, General Groves, who was there at the early years during the Manhattan Project. And, things have changed quite a bit, because other things one can remember is that they used to patrol the laboratory in horseback. And that was rather interesting, because you see them everywhere. And of course, as you're going up to the laboratory, you had the east gate that you had to get across there before you can get into the lab. And one of the interesting things was that there was a very narrow road, and every morning you had to go in the morning, and it took you a whole long hours to get up to the laboratory because of the every vehicle had to be checked, every individual had to be checked for their badges. So those were the early years. As much as I remember, I did go back to work as a full-time employee after serving 2 years at the Air Force back in 1950. By then, things had changed a little bit, although a lot of the folks, the most notable scientists that were still worked there, people who actually were part of the first atomic bomb, putting it together and seeing the first test and all of that. Those members, I still remember them very well. In fact, in later years, we became real good friends, and not only good friends, but serving various boards and commissions together. So, it's kind of neat to reflect back on those years. I finally did some research on thermonuclear research in search of new powers. But those same scientists that did work at the bomb at the time, continued to work in other phases of the science, and it was then interesting to see them change from what they did before to what they were doing then in the later years. I remember the area pretty well, the Omega Canyon. I think they had the first reactor down at Omega Canyon as well. And I remember going there to take inventories as I worked at the laboratory, taking inventories and not being very cognizant of the dangers of radiation and things like that, and high voltages. But we all learned, and we all contributed to the success of the laboratory. And most of us, I in fact still a member of the board. Member of the board of governors that run the laboratory. But looking back, I'm one of those individuals, I guess, if you look at it from starting from a dishwasher to now a member of the board of governors that run the laboratory, wrote up the corporate letter, So I'm very proud of the contributions I think I've made to the laboratory. And for others, because I've trained a lot of people from the valley in the various phases of the work that needed to be done in the technical area. So that's pretty much, I guess, what I can remember in terms of, unless you have some questions, permanent questions that I can ask.
Did you have any co-workers that worked with you at the mess hall?
Yes, I remember, I think it was Bonifacio Maestas, from San Juan Pueblo. And there was Pat Gutierrez, I think, from Velarde, who I think he's just passed on here a while back. It's amazing that all of us, after working there at the Los Alamos Manhattan Project, after we all graduated from high school, we all left to the service. We all joined the Air Force. And amazingly enough, some of those individuals, retired actually from the U.S. Air Force. I was only served 2 years and decided to come back, and that's how I have an association with the laboratory in 1950.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about any experiences at the PX
in terms of
in Los Alamos? Did you go there for recreation or?
At Los Alamos?
Yes, at Los Alamos.
Oh, of course, yeah. Yeah, well, before work, obviously, you couldn't do it unless you had a badge. And to get a badge, it was very, very difficult. In fact, one of the experiences I had early on was the fact after I got married, that I would have my wife come and pick me up at the lab. And for some reason or another, her name is Maria Ana, and I've known her for Anacita forever. And so when I had a clearance for her, I've always named her Enacita. So obviously when she got to the gate, they wouldn't let her in because her name was Maria Ana and not Enacita, But yeah, one of the things we enjoyed, obviously, when we were still in high school was the competing against Los Alamos High School. Mm-hmm. We always got beat by them, for some reason or another. They always have better teams. But in terms of recreation, not really, because I'm not a golfer. And then they had the first golf course, I guess, around here. Mm-hmm. And we used to come to play baseball, though. To play ball against them up here in Los Alamos. I remember Parati and those guys who used to have a softball team, a very good softball team. A 5-man softball team could beat anybody. 20 ball team, I guess. They were that good. But, what's interesting is about how Los Alamos has changed since then. Because we used to have, remember there was a theater, they had a theater there in the Central. They had a bowling alley and Sparky's. Of course, how could anybody ever forget Sparky's restaurant? And but now all the things are gone, and there's no offices. It's a change forever, I guess.
Do you remember your salary when you first started?
Of course, when I first started working there as the mess attendant, I think it was $1,420 a year. There wasn't very much, but it's amazing how one was very frugal at the time, and money was actually meant a lot more apparently because, later on as I signed out with the laboratory as a full employee, I think I started $1.25 an hour. And it's amazing enough, for those years I got married, I was able to build a house because I actually live in the reservation in San Juan Pueblo. I couldn't borrow money from anybody. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing how I was able to build a house in about 5 years. But when I built it, I didn't know a penny because I couldn't borrow any money. Mm-hmm. People had to, I had to buy materials on credit. And I was able to do all of that and was able to build my house. So.
Do you have any recollections of the housing at Los Alamos when you stayed there? How was the housing?
Oh, yeah, it was all very poor housing. Everybody complained about the housing. It was a lot better than most of us had here in the valley anyway. But people lived, pretty cramped places, and the only ones who actually lived in maybe more modern houses were the scientists, the main scientists that came up here. But soldiers lived in regular barracks just like anybody else. And some of the families of the workers lived in very poor housing at the time, And there was several families to a complex. Mm-hmm. There was very little privacy, but they all got along real well, I guess, because obviously in times things changed and the government started building separate homes, individual homes for some of the people who could afford it. Mm-hmm. And then eventually, those apartments, complexes, were actually sold to individuals, and they all made improvements on them, of course, Obviously, before then, they couldn't do it because they all belonged to the federal government, and they had to do well with what they had.
Did you have any idea of what was going on at Los Alamos when you first went there?
Not when I first came there.
Yeah, okay.
Not at all.
Did anybody say anything about security, about what was going on?
No, the interesting part about the whole thing was that you couldn't talk about Los Alamos. You talked about 1663, it became a real key word, when you spoke about Los Alamos, I remember when I first got my job, I had to go to Santa Fe, and I applied to work in Santa Fe, and I said, well, I'm going to work in Los Alamos, why do I have to apply in Santa Fe? And that was, where the recruitment went on, and that's where you signed up. Then come to find out that you needed a special badge, and the scrutiny over your security was very, very, very high. And it didn't matter whether you were a little guy or big guy or whatever, everybody had to go through the same kind of scrutiny in terms of security. And that has remained for the laboratory now too, you know, so.
Do you remember anything happening right after Trinity site? Did anybody talk about the Trinity test?
But
Trinity test, the test at Trinity site.
well, you know, I do remember about the bomb
Yeah.
when it was first tested there in Alamogordo. Everybody wondered what people were doing in secrecy, you know, and before we knew it, very few people even knew that there was something was going on in Alamogordo. But you know, later they became real good friends with some of the people who took part in the actual getting the bomb together at Alamogordo for its first test. You know, were part of my family that I knew here as workers afterwards, and they used to talk about the hard times, you know, and the exciting times at the time, you know, and obviously nobody knew what it would really mean after the test, you know. And once it was tested, of course, people knew what we got, and the whole world has changed ever since.
Do you remember what happened after the war ended? Were you on the premises when the war ended? Los Alamos?
No, I was not. See, the war ended, what, in 1945?
45.
45. See, I was here kind of like towards the end, you know, but that was before the bomb was dropped. So, no, you know, other than the fact that we all knew about the bomb then, and we all knew what the destruction it did, you know. But, you know, if you go back, you remember when war was declared, was 1941? 1941. I remember being at my grandmother's house, and the only thing you had was a radio, you know, and we were having lunch, and lunch or something in the morning or something. And I remember the news coming on radio that Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor, and we were at war. And of course, my grandma and my mother and everybody started crying, only because, you know, my uncle was at that age of being able to be inducted to the service. And he did, you know, and unfortunately he went through some real hard times, and he came back very sick, and eventually died. But yeah, those are very, very, very hard times. But I don't remember exactly what happened after the war ended here in Los Alamos. That period is kind of blank, because you remember, I came to work at the lab in 1950 as a permanent employee. By then, everything has already been done, you know.
Overall, what are your impressions of the contributions of the people from the valley for Los Alamos?
Well, you know, people had different kinds of jobs, menial jobs, very important jobs, technical jobs. And the thing about it was interesting at the time was that, remember, the whole valley was very poor, and we had very few highly educated individuals. And so as a consequence, you know, it was very hard for the laboratory to recruit individuals who could go into the technical field. But it was amazing that a lot of people learned a lot of things, technical jobs on the job training, and became very, very, very good at it. You know, there were some things that some of our people used to be able to do that other people couldn't do. Not even highly educated people. You know, I came in at the time, kind of like at that time too, in 1950, and learned most of my physics and science and anything I know technically from my employers, my group leaders, my program leaders, you know, because we did a lot of experimenting together. But it was a lot of job training, and I was here at a time when things have changed a lot. Because I remember, you know, in the early years where even the custodians were were old men who couldn't probably do anything else, you know, were driven in, and those were the custodians. As time went on, and things got a little more sophisticated, you know, high school individuals, young men, used to get off on the same buses to work as custodians. And so that has changed a lot, you see. So now, for instance, if you want a technical job, you better go to a technical school before you even get in, at all.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, if you really want to do some things, you better have a good education, college education,
Yeah. Okay. What is your connection with the lab now?
Well, my connection with the lab is, after 42 years as a thermonuclear research scientist there, I finally retired in 1991. But apparently because I've been in politics for a long time too, And my first office that I ran for was the county commission, Rio Riva County, back in 1964. So I served from 1964 to 1968 as a county commissioner. And amazingly enough, the laboratory was generous enough to be able to allow us to serve as well as work at the laboratory. And so then after that, I ran for the House of Representatives and been there ever since. But since I retired from the laboratory, I became a safety officer for the various of my division. And then after that, I became kind of a consultant. Since I have a lot of political connections, I guess, the laboratory used my influence with our congressional delegation for various things, obviously funding and the contract at the time with the University of California. And since then, obviously, since we've now gone to a private contractor, I'm now a member of the Board of Governors with Bechtel, 3RW, the Washington Group, and others as a member of the board that run the laboratory, not only the laboratory here in Los Alamos, but Lawrence Livermore as well.
Mm-hmm. How many of the lab directors did you know personally?
All of them.
All of them, okay.
All of them, starting with, well, General Brewer was not a director, he was the Army General at the time, but I do remember Oppenheimer. And from Oppenheimer, I remember, what's the name, Bradbury.
Mm-hmm.
And Bradbury, we came, I guess we had Agnew, and then we had, what was the name of the other guy?
Donald Kerr. Don Kerr.
Donald Kerr. I know him all real well because I did a lot, I communicated a lot with him in terms of my politics, obviously, with the laboratory. And then, of course, John Brown, he was kind of a family guy with me, and so was the one that came afterward.
Sig Hecker.
Hecker and I, visited each other's house pretty regular. We used to eat together all the time, And so I knew him real well. And then after Hecker, what's his name?
Nanos.
I could have forgotten Nano, Yeah, but he was here for a short time. And a lot of people had some problems with him, I found him to be a very interesting man. I like Nano, And now with the Anastasio, he and I have very good buddies, since we both serve on the board, and I know the new guy that came in as the new deputy director also doing pretty well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say very few people have contributed. You are probably the person that's contributed the most.
Well, in terms, I think, in terms of public relations and government relations and those kinds of things, never mind what I did, as a research assistant with the scientists there, but I think my biggest contribution was the friendship that we developed, and the good relations between the community and the laboratory, because that's always been a sore spot too, And I was able to kind of come there and kind of smooth it out, and help out for these many years, and I still do it, because I get along real well with all the tribes, and my son being governor for a while, so he and I have a connection as well. So, but and I continue to do that. Now, for instance, as a legislator, I'm able to do things that help the laboratory too, you know. Because, you know, whether we like it or not, and I think the most important thing that I've been able to do is make people aware of the fact that without the laboratory, you know, what in New Mexico we would be, you know. Because I remember before the laboratory, we were all, you know, there was nothing here. After the laboratory, you know, now you can see in the community we have better homes, a lot of cars, televisions, you know, things like that. More college graduates, people going to school and graduating. So in terms of a socioeconomic, that has changed totally around for our valley. And I would hate to see anything, you know, that the laboratory, it's not that the laboratory hasn't contributed to the world, you know, not only to this country, but to the world in terms of peace, because of what we do here, you know, in spite of a lot of people thinking otherwise, that the bomb, you know. But I think that, if anything, I think that the bomb has served as a deterrent now, you know, for peace in the world.
Well, do you have any questions, any idea? You know, somebody that has had so much experience at the lab, and then technical and also administrative.
Let me stray from the Manhattan Project to a little bit on the H-bomb, the Mike shot in 1952, I think it was.
1952, yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about that time?
Well, you know, it's amazing that at that time when we graduated from the A-bomb to the hydrogen bomb, you know, there was very little discussion on what was going on other than what had actually happened. And remember too, you know, that we were very involved in thermonuclear research, you know. Our job was to find ways, you know, to replace some of the natural resources that we have in terms of the power we need for the future. And we were always competing with other laboratories throughout the country, you know. Amazingly enough, that project has become so big and so expensive, so costly, that it's now a worldwide endeavor. I guess primarily in Italy, you know. But no other than the fact that it happened. And quite frankly, it's amazing because it happened right under our nose, you know, too, you know. Because we had something to contribute to it too. But I remember, you know, at the time that we were all trying to see how we could heat enough plasma, you know, and because I had the privilege of going to the Geneva Conference, you know, pieces of atomic energy, you know, where I think 92 nations were gathered at the time. It's amazing because it was at the time when the Sputnik had gone around the globe, you know. And we had that little thing that had gone up and come down, you know. So it was really embarrassing there in Geneva at the time that we didn't have nothing much to brag about. Mm. But, you know, it's amazing how that spurred this country to become the world leader in space exploration, you know.
Mm-hmm. What year did you go to Geneva?
Must have been in 1964, right. 64, 65, I remember the years, but that was an experience and a half, you know, to meet so many different scientists from all over the world. And obviously it was on peaceful use of atomic energy, so it had nothing to do with a bomb or anything like that, but it did have a lot to do with how we were going to find new power sources for the future. And the competition was humongous at the time. Mm-hmm. I mean, tell you, anybody who could create plasma here and there, you know. And as it turned out, you know, it turned out to be pretty tough. While we were able to achieve it, it's very expensive, and it might take a long time before we can make it pay off, you know. But eventually, who knows, we might wind up having to do that.
Who else from Los Alamos or from this area went to the Geneva Conference?
Well, there were several scientists that went. Well, we had the whole thermonuclear research people here at the laboratory went at that time. It was such an interesting thing because we had to ship everything we had over here. I mean, from the nails to the hammer to putting the things we got over there. It turned out that their power was different.
Mm-hmm.
We had to convert everything back to we could use our equipment.
Mm-hmm.
But vacuum systems, the whole thing had to go. Had to be back. My job at the time was to see that everything got there, and to see that everything got back. I spent, and of course after the conference, everybody left back home. So I was only myself and another guy who was left there. I had a crew of 20 Italians and Frenchmen, and I didn't speak French or Italian, But I was in charge of having to see that every piece of equipment got back here. And the only thing that didn't get back here was the camera, amazingly enough. And about 2 months later, the camera arrived also. So we took a lot of stuff, but we brought it all back.
Mm-hmm. Did you represent the lab at any other conference overseas?
Let me see. Well, yeah. I worked at the Savannah River plant where I was one of the members of the team that was sent there to discover the neutrino. And that was an interesting experiment, working right at the reactor. And I remember, because we had to do the experiment right next to the reactor, for capture the neutrinos, and we had these humongous tanks filled with some liquid, and amazing now how things have changed in the world. But we built a wall with lead bricks. You know how lead now has become, you can't touch it, you can't do it. We built a big lead wall, around it where we work. But the most interesting thing that I can remember is going into the reactor, and what's in the reactor, because they used to load the reactor, and the reactor would keep going all the time. But we used to walk around the reactor, and there was this humongous pool of water, and they had the sources, stuck in the water. And the pool was blue, real blue. But the most interesting thing that I can remember there at the Savannah River plant was how they loaded those nuclear rods, into a train. They somehow drove in the train and were able to put in the radioactive sources that they delivered apparently to other reactors around the country. Mm. But being able to do that, and then after that, what happened after that, I don't know. I don't know how they got him over there, but yeah. And then because of my legislative work, I've been to Nevada various times because I was in the Hazardous Material Waste Management Committee that visited Las Vegas a lot. I went to the Yucca Mountain before they even started the first hole. Then I went later when we had a tunnel, and they had various experiments all over the area there. Nobody could ever convince me. I didn't say much, but how dry it was and everything else. But everywhere we went where there was a tunnel, there was a leak of water. And I remember having these big sources, I guess, underground. They stuck them in the ground there, but everywhere we went, there was. Even at in Carlsbad, besides all that salt, and then I've gone through a lot of those compartments there at the Carlsbad site, and every once in a while you see a little drop of water in that salt. And obviously we're supposed to have no water there, But, I guess it's a safe space. I was reading yesterday or the day before yesterday about how safe it's been, and a lot of people were afraid. And it's amazing how it is, that after all of that, so many people are so afraid of anything now that has to be nuclear. When we, I think we know better, we were better educated, we know safety issues. When I started working at the laboratory, there was I'm sure you know the fact that there was no environmental regulations, no safety regulations, no nothing. I mean, you did a job because it had to be done. You did things, you know, and tabletop experiments all the time. You know, nobody. I remember seeing the first laser when the lab had the first laser. This guy got a shot in his eye. You know, he wanted to see how the laser worked. You know, yeah. But you know, things have changed a little bit, and I think that the greatest hamper to research has been the safety and regulations. Obviously, we have to have them. Environmental safety and regulations, you know, because it stopped a lot of the research, you know, that used to go on all the time, and I think it kind of hindered it. We were doing a lot more things before than we did after that, because now you have to be accountable for everything. I did the first precious metal inventory at the laboratory, way back in the 50s. You know, I would find pieces, huge chunks of gold, bookends or door stops, and people didn't care. I mean, I used to transport these humongous gold spheres, platinum spheres, and silver spheres from one place to another. Nobody checked me. I couldn't take it home. But I do remember one thing: these guys who stole some gold. I don't know if you remember that these people stole some gold, several from CMR. And I think it was Oklahoma City where they decided to stop for the night. And these guys, I guess, went out on a binge and they got drunk and got put in jail. And obviously in jail, you know, they search you and you get to, so they found a lot of pieces of gold they had in their pocket. So they decided to check the room, and sure enough, they found all the gold that they stole. The bricks of gold. I remember them, you know, and because I was there when when they brought him back. But that's how lax things were, you know, and quite frankly, even during the Manhattan Project, you know, the stories were, I don't know. I mean, you know, a lot of people suffer from not being able to buy tires at the time. My employees at the laboratory had tires. They had a big garage, you know. And some people used to say that, by golly, that even motors were stolen. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think we're very lax. You know, now things have turned out for the better, I guess, except for the fact of research. I think research has been hampered in a lot of ways by a lot of restrictions that go on, you know. I mean, scientists should be allowed to do what they do best, you know. Because, you know, it's easier to do it on a tabletop than trying to cover every possible mistake, because that hinders time.
Let's go back to the neutrino experiment. So that meant you were working with Fred Reine.
Fred Reine, Dr. Cowan, Clyde Cowan, and two other guys were there, you know. And I became kind of, and Marty Warren, I don't know if you remember Marty Warren. He was one of my best friends, you know. And it was very interesting because it's not only an experiment there, but Clyde Cowan later, you know, I knew his father. I mean, his father used to work in the Eastgate lab there. But Clyde Cowan told me once, he said, you know, Representative, at the time he told me, you know, Nick, he said, the best way to learn is to teach. And you know, after the neutrino experiment, he actually quit and went to teach. Fred Reine became Fred Reine. He's still around, you know. And but there were others there. Marty Warren has passed away, and several other guys over there has passed away. But coming back, it was the most interesting trip I ever taken anywhere around the country, because we had this trailer, this electronic trailer, which was 2 feet higher than any other trailer, than the regular trailer, you know. So coming back, we had to have an escort, and we had the guy point of us, you know, they came on the road, measure every bridge across it, you know, to see if we could go under it. If not, we had to go hundreds of miles around it. You know, it took us from Savannah River, I guess, I remember, it took us something like 7 days to get here. But we didn't make it, you know. And then we had these big, humongous tanks full of liquid that also couldn't leak, you know. And so, but since then too, you know, I guess people have found even smaller particles in the neutrino, I guess. But that was very interesting. That was an interesting experiment. So we had this guy in a Cadillac, of all things, you know, he was in a Cadillac driving behind us because we couldn't drive more than 15, 20 miles an hour, either because of the liquid. And here the guy had bought a brand new Cadillac out there in Savannah River, and he was driving in the back of the Cadillac at 15, 20 miles an hour, all the way down to Los Alamos. And I was involved too also in the big generator that we have now here. I was in charge of clearing the way from the tribes and the roads, highway department, and everything that, when you remember, we came through Espanola with a big generator there. I remember how many tires that truck had, you know, trailer. But we got it up there, and they're still working. Now I think they have a contract with the University of Arizona. Not Arizona, Florida State University. I think they have a contract with them doing research, magnetic field effects, I guess. So I've been in some of the real interesting things that happen at the laboratory, you know.